The big hall was packed with people. Hundreds of chairs were filled, and the air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh coffee. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes. The men wore shiny shoes and dark suits that looked like they cost a lot of money. The women wore bright jewelry and dresses that sparkled under the bright lights. It was the kind of place where people went to see and be seen, a very important competition for the best talents in the country. The mood in the room was excited, but also a bit cold. People were talking quietly, laughing, and looking at their phones, waiting for the show to start, but in the corner of the room, far away from the main stage, sat a young woman named Priya. She looked very different from everyone else. While others looked relaxed and confident, she looked nervous. Her hands were shaking a little as she held onto a small, worn-out notebook. Her dress was simple. It was a light blue color, clean and neat, but it didn't have the fancy labels or the expensive fabric that the other women wore. In fact, she had bought it second-hand from a small shop in her neighborhood just a week ago, because she couldn't afford anything else. Priya came from a very simple family. Her parents worked hard every day, but there was never much extra money. She had saved every penny from her small part-time job for months just to pay the entry fee for this competition. She didn't have a famous teacher. She didn't go to a big fancy school. She learned her craft by watching videos on the internet and practicing in her small bedroom late at night after her work was done. For her, being here was a dream that felt almost too big to be real. As the time for the start got closer, Priya stood up to walk toward the backstage area. She tried to be invisible, walking with her head down, hoping no one would notice her simple dress or her old shoes. But it didn't work. A small group of other contestants standing near the curtain saw her coming. They were the types who had everything handed to them. They had rich parents, expensive training, and an attitude that said they owned the place. One of them, a tall young woman with perfect hair, looked Priya up and down. She didn't say anything, but she let out a loud, mocking laugh that made her friends giggle. Another one whispered loudly, "Do you think she got lost on her way to the bus stop?" They all laughed again. It was a mean sound, sharp and hurtful. Priya heard every word. Her face got hot with embarrassment, but she kept walking. She told herself she was used to it. She had heard things like that before, but deep down it hurt. It made her feel small, like she didn't belong. Backstage, the atmosphere was even worse. Priya stood in a line with the other performers. The judges were sitting at a long table just a few feet away. They were famous people, known for being very strict and hard to please. They were looking through papers, drinking water, and looking bored. When it was Priya's turn to check in, one of the judges looked over his glasses at her. He looked at her simple notebook, then at her face. He raised an eyebrow, looking surprised. "Is this your first time in a real competition, young lady?" he asked in a dry voice. It wasn't a friendly question. It sounded like he was saying she had no chance. Priya swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "But I have practiced very hard." The judge didn't smile. He just nodded once and looked back at his papers, dismissing her. "Well, let's hope you don't waste our time," he muttered loud enough for her to hear. Priya walked to the side of the stage, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She felt sick to her stomach. The other contestants were laughing and joking, confident they were going to win. They looked at her with pity like she was a lamb going to a slaughter. They expected her to fail. They were waiting for her to mess up so they could have something else to laugh about. She peeked through the heavy curtain and looked out at the crowd. There were so many people. It looked like a sea of faces. The lights were so bright they hurt her eyes. She felt the weight of all their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She knew what they were thinking. They saw a girl in a cheap dress and they assumed she wasn't talented. They judged her before she even said a word. Priya closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. She remembered why she was there. She remembered the late nights, the sore fingers, the tired eyes, and the dream that kept her going. She wasn't doing this for the rich judges or the mean girls in the fancy dresses. She was doing it for herself and for her family, who were watching at home on a small TV, praying for her. A man in a headset came up to her. Okay, you're next, he said quickly. Get ready. Priya's legs felt heavy as she walked toward the center of the stage. The laughter backstage faded into the background, replaced by the loud murmur of the crowd. She stepped into the light. The host announced her name, but he didn't sound excited. He sounded like he was just reading a grocery list. The crowd didn't cheer. They just clapped politely, a quiet, polite sound that was worse than booing. It showed that they didn't care. They were waiting for the next person. She stood there, alone in the bright circle of light. The silence was heavy. She could see the judges in the distance, leaning back in their chairs, arms crossed, waiting for the disaster. She could feel the eyes of the hundreds of people watching her, looking for a mistake. The pressure was crushing. This was the moment where most people would give up. This was the moment where the fear would win, but Priya didn't run away. She gripped her notebook tight, took one last breath to steady her shaking hands, and prepared to show them that she was more than just her dress. She was ready to fight. The light above the stage was incredibly bright. It wasn't a soft, warm light like the sun in the morning. It was a harsh, white beam that felt like it was burning right through her. Priya stood there in the middle of the circle of light, blinking her eyes rapidly. Because the light was so strong, she couldn't see the audience clearly. Everything beyond the edge of the stage was just a deep, black hole. She knew hundreds of people were sitting there in the dark, watching her, waiting, but she couldn't see their faces. She could only feel them. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room, leaving her standing in a vacuum where it was hard to breathe. Her heart was beating so hard that she could hear it thumping in her ears, like a drum that was playing way too fast. Thump, 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 thump. It was so loud she was afraid the microphone in front of her would pick up the sound. Her hands were shaking, not just a little bit, but enough that she had to clasp them together to hide the trembling. Her palms were sweaty, making her grip slippery. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, even though the heat from the spotlights was making her face feel like it was on fire. She opened her mouth to say hello, to introduce herself, but her throat felt dry, like sandpaper. The words just wouldn't come out. She felt very, very small. The stage was so huge and empty, and she was just a tiny dot standing in the middle of it. She looked over toward the judges' table. It felt like it was a mile away. The three judges were sitting in their high, comfortable chairs, looking down at her. The man in the middle was the most intimidating. He had his arms crossed tightly over his chest, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't looking at her with kindness or curiosity. He was looking at his watch, tapping his foot on the floor impatiently. It was a clear signal. He was bored. He had already decided she wasn't worth his time. The woman judge sitting next to him was busy writing something on a piece of paper, her head down. She didn't even look up when Priya stepped forward. She might have been making notes about the previous contestant, or maybe she was writing a grocery list. It didn't matter. The message was the same. They didn't care. The third judge was sipping water slowly, his eyes half closed, looking like he was about to fall asleep. Their attitude hung in the air like a heavy cloud. They weren't waiting to be amazed. They were waiting for her to finish so they could move on to someone who they thought actually mattered. The silence in the room was heavy and uncomfortable. In the quiet moments before she started, small sounds seemed deafening. Someone in the back row coughed loudly, breaking the silence. A baby cried for a second somewhere in the hall and was quickly hushed. The rustling of programs, the sound of people shifting in their seats, the soft buzz of whispers, it all mixed together to create a wall of noise. It felt like no one was paying attention. People were checking their phones, the blue glow of their screens lighting up their faces in the dark. It felt like they were just waiting for the coffee break. Priya took a deep, shaky breath and reached out to touch the microphone stand. She needed to adjust it because she was shorter than the person who used it before her. She reached out a trembling hand to grab the cold metal dot as her fingers brushed against the stand. A terrible, high-pitched, screeching noise blasted through the speakers. Screech. It was the sound of feedback, sharp and jagged. It hurt everyone's ears instantly. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and harsh. A collective groan of annoyance rolled through the auditorium like a wave. It wasn't a groan of sympathy. It was a groan of anger. Several people laughed, a mean, mocking laugh that cut through the air. It was the kind of laugh that bullies give. "Get it together!" A man's voice shouted loudly from the back of the room. Someone else whistled low, mimicking a failing sound. Priya froze. Her hand was still on the microphone, and her face turned bright red with shame. It felt like someone had poured hot water over her head. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. This was exactly what the mean girls in the hallway had expected. This was what the judges had predicted. She was a mess. She couldn't even handle a microphone stand. She felt hot tears stinging the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over. She blinked them back rapidly, biting her lip. She could not cry. Not here. Not in front of all these people. If she cried, she would prove them right. A stage manager rushed out from the side, a young man with a headset. He looked angry. He quickly adjusted the cord, twisted the stand, and gave Priya a stern look before rushing off the stage without saying a word. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just fixed the problem and left. Now it was just Priya again. The silence that followed the screeching noise was even heavier than before. It was an awkward, painful silence. Everyone was waiting to see what she would do. Would she run away? Would she apologize? The pressure was immense. It felt like the whole world was pressing down on her shoulders, trying to crush her. The judge in the middle shook his head slowly and wrote something down on his paper. Probably a 0, but then, in the middle of all that embarrassment and fear, something strange happened inside Priya. She looked down at her worn shoes again. She thought about her small, messy house. She thought about the leaky roof that they fixed with tape. She thought about her parents working double shifts, coming home tired and smiling at her. She realized something important right there. These people, with their expensive suits and their fancy drinks and their bored faces, they didn't know her. They didn't know what she had survived to get here. They thought she was a joke, but she knew the truth. She had a fire inside her that they couldn't see. They thought she was weak because she was quiet and poor. But they didn't know that being quiet meant you are listening. And being poor meant you are hungry for a chance. She realized something that made her stand up a little straighter. She had absolutely nothing to lose. The worst thing that could happen had already happened. They had already laughed at her. They had already judged her. They had already rolled their eyes. They couldn't hurt her any more than they already had. The fear was still there, but suddenly the shame was gone. She decided she wasn't going to try to impress them. She wasn't going to try to sing or act like the fancy teachers in the book said. She wasn't going to try to be perfect like the other contestants. She was going to do this for herself. She was going to do this for the little girl who sat on the balcony dreaming of this moment. Priya closed her eyes. She shut out the blinding lights. She shut out the judges who were looking at their watches. She shut out the whispering crowd and the man who had shouted at her. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air, and let it out slowly. She waited for the air in the room to settle. She waited for her heart to stop racing quite so fast. And then she began. She didn't start with a shout or a fancy trick. She started with a soft, gentle hum that grew into a clear, strong note. It wasn't a performance style that the elite music schools taught. It wasn't technical or stiff. It was raw. It came from a place deep in her chest, a place of pain and hope mixed together. As the first line left her lips, the sound was so different from what anyone expected that the room seemed to stop. The people in the front row, who were looking at their phones, slowly lowered their devices. The judge, who was tapping his watch, stopped his foot. The mean laughter in the back died down instantly. The sound that was coming from the small, simply dressed girl was not what they expected. It was real. And in a room full of fake lights and fake smiles, real is the only thing that catches your attention. The sound that came out of her was not what anyone expected. It wasn't the high, sweet, candy-coated pop sound that usually won these kinds of competitions. It wasn't perfect or polished in a way that a machine could make it. Instead, it was deep and rough around the edges, like a stone that had been tumbling in a river for a long time. It had a scratchy quality to it that sounded honest. It sounded like a real person who had felt real pain. At first, the crowd didn't know how to react. They were used to performers coming out and smiling big fake smiles, shaking their hips, and trying to be entertaining instantly. But Priya just stood there. She had her eyes closed, her head tilted slightly back, and she was pouring every ounce of her energy into the microphone. She was singing a slow, sad song that was difficult to pull off. The notes were long and required a lot of breath control. For the first 30 seconds, the room stayed mostly the same. People were still whispering. The man in the front row was still looking at his phone. The mean girls in the wings were still giggling behind their hands. To them, she was just the poor girl who was taking up time. They were waiting for her voice to crack, waiting for her to run out of breath, waiting for the inevitable failure that would give them something to gossip about later. Then, it happened right in the middle of a difficult verse. A man in the third row, maybe feeling bored or maybe just drunk, let out a loud, obnoxious yawn. He shouted, trying to be funny. A few people around him laughed nervously. It was a clear attempt to throw her off. It was the kind of rude behavior that ruins a performance. Usually, when this happens to a new contestant, they get scared. They stop singing. They apologize to the crowd. They lose their place and stumble over the words, and the judges write them off immediately. Priya heard the man. She heard the laugh. Her eyes opened for just a second, flashing a look that was not scared, but fierce. She didn't stop singing. She didn't miss a beat. In fact, she did something amazing. She took that anger she felt toward the rude man and she used it. She didn't get sad. She got powerful. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage, right toward the man who had shouted. Her voice suddenly got louder, booming through the speakers like thunder. It wasn't a scream. It was a controlled, powerful roar that seemed to shake the dust off the ceiling lights. The notes she hit were so strong and so clear that they physically vibrated in the chests of the people sitting in the front rows. The laughter died instantly. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The man who shouted looked surprised and then a little bit scared. He shrank back in his seat, sinking down low so he wouldn't be seen. He realized he had made a mistake. He had woken up a sleeping tiger. That was the moment everything changed. The vibe in the room shifted completely. The air suddenly felt electric. People who were looking at their phones slowly put them down, screened down on their laps. People who were whispering to their neighbors stopped mid-sentence. Their heads started to turn toward the stage. It was like a magnetic force was pulling their attention to this small woman in the blue dress. Priya felt it happen. She couldn't see their faces clearly because of the lights, but she could feel the silence change. Before, the silence was heavy and bored. Now the silence was sharp and attentive. They were listening. They were actually listening. This gave her a burst of adrenaline. She stopped thinking about the rules. She forgot about the judges who wanted her to fail. She forgot about the fancy girls backstage. She closed her eyes again and let the music take her completely away. She started to improvise, adding little runs and trills to the song that weren't written on the page. She bent the notes, twisting them with emotion, making the song sound like a cry for help and a victory shout all at the same time. She wasn't just singing a song anymore. She was telling a story. She was singing about the struggle of waking up every day with nothing. She was singing about the feeling of working until your hands bleed, but still not having enough. She was singing about the hunger to be seen, to be respected, to be valued. It was a feeling that everyone in that room understood, even the rich people. Everyone has felt small at some point in their lives. Everyone has felt like the underdog. The judges were the first to really show a reaction. The woman in the middle, the one who had been writing in her notebook without looking up, suddenly put her pen down. She looked up, her eyes wide. She pushed her glasses up her nose and stared at the stage, a confused look on her face as if to say, "Who is this?" The man who had been tapping his watch stopped his foot. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He wasn't looking at his watch anymore. He was staring right at Priya, his mouth slightly open. Even the technician in the back of the room, The one who had rushed out to fix the microphone stand with an angry face was standing still now. He was watching the monitor, holding his headphones to his ears, a look of pure respect on his face. The song was building up to its climax. The tempo was getting faster, and Priya's voice was getting stronger with every word. She was walking back and forth across the stage now, owning the space. Her shyness was gone. She was reaching her hand out toward the audience, not begging for approval, but commanding their attention. She was sweating, her hair sticking to her forehead, but she looked beautiful. She looked alive. There was a fire in her eyes that you couldn't teach in a school. You had to live through hard times to get that kind of fire. She hit a series of high notes that were so difficult, so technically risky, that the whole room held its breath. It was the kind of moment where one wrong move would be a disaster. She didn't flinch. She nailed every single one, her voice soaring high and cutting through the air like a knife. When she held the final note of the verse, she didn't let go. She held it and held it, her chest expanding, her hand reaching out to the ceiling. The note vibrated through the speakers, filling every corner of the massive hall. It was a sound of defiance. It was a sound that said, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere." The crowd was mesmerized. You could see a tall man in the back row stand up, craning his neck to see over the heads in front of him. People in the front row were leaning forward, their mouths open, completely forgetting about their expensive drinks and their fancy clothes. The judgment had vanished, replaced by shock. They were witnessing a transformation right in front of their eyes. The girl they thought would fail was now flying higher than anyone else. Who had stepped on that stage all day? Priya took a quick breath. Preparing for the final chorus, and for the first time, she opened her eyes wide and looked directly into the darkness of the crowd. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there. She knew they were finally watching her. And she smiled, a tiny, confident smile. She wasn't the underdog anymore. She was the star. The silence that followed Priya's powerful run of high notes was unlike anything the auditorium had heard all day. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, buzzing silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something truly shocking occurs. When hundreds of people are so busy trying to process what they just saw that they forget to make any noise at all. Priya stood center stage, her chest heaving up and down, gasping for air. Sweat was dripping down her forehead and onto her nose, but she didn't wipe it away. She was in the zone now, a place where fear couldn't touch her. She wasn't thinking about her simple dress or her cheap shoes anymore. She wasn't thinking about the judges who had looked at their watches. She was only thinking about the song, and she was about to deliver the most important part of it. She looked out into the black void of the audience. She still couldn't see their faces, but she could feel the mood shift completely. The feeling of judgment was gone. In its place was a sense of anticipation. Even the man who had shouted earlier was completely quiet. You could feel the energy in the room changing from negative to positive, like a storm cloud suddenly breaking open to let the sun shine through. Then Priya launched into the final chorus. This was the moment she had been saving her energy for. She didn't hold anything back. Her voice came out stronger than ever, filling every corner of the massive hall. It was a sound that was raw and full of emotion. It sounded like she was singing for her life. Every word she sang had a meaning behind it. She wasn't just saying words. She was telling a story about fighting back, about surviving, and about refusing to let other people tell you who you are. The effect on the crowd was instant and physical. People who had been slouching in their chairs suddenly sat up straight. The man in the third row, the one who had tried to make fun of her, looked frozen. His face had turned red, perhaps from shame, perhaps from amazement. He wasn't laughing now. He was staring at the stage with his mouth slightly open, completely mesmerized. Even the judges, who had been so cold and critical only minutes ago, were completely different people now. The woman judge who had been writing in her notebook had finally put her pen down completely. She wasn't writing anything. She was just looking up at the stage, her eyes wide and unblinking. A small smile was starting to form on her lips, a look of genuine surprise and respect. It seemed like she was realizing that she had been completely wrong about. Priya, The strict man in the middle had uncrossed his arms and was leaning so far forward on the table that he was almost falling out of his chair. He wasn't tapping his foot anymore. He was conducting the music softly with his hand, lost in the music. For the first time that day, they weren't looking for mistakes. They were witnessing a masterpiece. Backstage, the mood among the other contestants had shifted from cruel laughter to stunned silence. The tall girl with the fancy dress who had made fun of Priya earlier was now standing with her arms crossed, her face pale. She was watching the monitor on the wall and she looked worried. She realized that no matter how expensive her dress was or how many lessons she had paid for, she didn't have what Priya had. She didn't have that fire. The other contestants stopped whispering. They just watched, realizing that they were in the presence of true talent. Something that can't be bought or faked. As the song went on, Priya started to move around the stage with a confidence she didn't have when she walked out. She wasn't hiding behind the microphone stand anymore. She stepped out from behind it, walking to the edge of the stage. She reached her hand out toward the audience, not in a begging way, but in a way that invited them into her world. She hit a series of notes that were so powerful and so clear that they vibrated in everyone's chest. It was a feeling you can't describe easily, but you know it when you feel it. It gives you goosebumps. It makes the hair on your arms stand up. All across the theater, people were getting chills. A woman in the front row reached up and wiped a tear from her eye. A man in an expensive suit took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, clearly moved. The music was touching them. It was breaking through the fancy walls they had built up around themselves. Priya's voice was echoing off the walls, loud and strong. She was improvising now, adding little extra notes that weren't in the sheet music, notes that showed her creativity and her soul. She was taking risks, big risks, but she was nailing every single one of them. She was pouring her heart out, leaving everything she had on that stage. There was no safety net. If she failed now, she would fail hard, but she didn't care. She was going to fly. The music reached its peak. It was the loudest, most intense part of the song. Priya's voice soared above the instruments, cutting through the air like a knife. She looked like a completely different person than the shy girl who had walked out 10 minutes ago. Her face was glowing with sweat and passion. Her eyes were bright with determination. She looked powerful. She looked like a star. The entire audience was captivated. You could hear a pin drop. No one was coughing. No one was shifting in their seats. No one was looking at their phones. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on the small figure in the simple blue dress. The arrogance that had filled the room earlier was gone. It had been replaced by awe. The people who expected her to fail were now leaning forward, desperate to see what she would do next. As the song neared its end, Priya slowed down. She brought the volume down, letting her voice become soft and gentle again. It was a smart move. It made the crowd lean in even closer, wanting to hear every last word. She sang the final lines with a tenderness that was heartbreaking. It was like she was whispering a secret to the whole room. She held the very last note, a long, sustained sound that slowly faded into silence. She didn't rush it. She let it hang in the air, beautiful and pure. And then she closed her mouth and lowered her hand. She stood there, alone on the stage, breathing hard, waiting. For a split second, there was still silence. It was a moment of suspension where everyone was just letting the music sink in. But then the dam broke. The silence that hung in the air for those few seconds after Priya stopped singing was the loudest silence she had ever heard. It was like the whole world was holding its breath at the exact same time. Priya stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her hands still resting gently on the microphone stand. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, a fast whooshing sound that made her feel dizzy. She didn't know what to think. Had she messed up? Was it too weird? Did they hate it? The uncertainty was terrifying. She looked out into the darkness, waiting for a sign, anything to tell her if she was going to walk off that stage in triumph or in shame. Then it happened. It started as a single clap, a sharp, loud sound from the back of the room. It was the tall man who had stood up earlier to get a better look. Then a woman in the front row joined in. Within moments, one person became 10, and 10 became 100. The sound grew incredibly fast, swelling from a gentle patter into a massive, deafening roar. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a thunderous wave of noise that crashed over the stage, but the noise wasn't just coming from the audience. People started to stand up. It started in the middle section and then spread like a ripple in a pond to the sides and the back. One by one, hundreds of people got up from their seats. The hall transformed into a sea of standing bodies, all facing one direction toward her. They were clapping their hands together so hard it looked like it hurt. Some were whistling, some were shouting, "Bravo!" and others were just stomping their feet on the floor, adding to the thunder. Priya's eyes went wide. She froze for a moment, completely overwhelmed. She had seen people get standing ovations on TV before, but she never thought she would hear one for herself. Especially not here, especially not today. The sound was so loud it vibrated in her chest. It felt like a physical weight, but instead of crushing her, it lifted her up. She looked at the judge's table. The transformation there was perhaps the most shocking of all. The strict man in the middle, the one who had been tapping his watch and looking bored, was now standing up. He was clapping his hands together with a big smile on his face. He wasn't just pretending, he looked genuinely delighted. The woman judge had taken off her glasses and was wiping her eyes with a tissue. She was crying happy tears. The third judge was looking at the other two, nodding his head as if to say, "I told you," or "Can you believe this?" The very people who had written her off before she sang were now her biggest fans. The rush of emotion hit Priya all at once. She felt a hot tear roll down her cheek, and then another. She didn't wipe them away, she let them fall. She had spent months feeling invisible, feeling like she wasn't good enough, feeling like she didn't belong in this world of rich and fancy people. But in this moment, she belonged. She wasn't the poor girl in the second-hand dress anymore. She was the queen of the stage. She slowly let go of the microphone stand. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the adrenaline rushing through her body. She took a small, clumsy bow. It wasn't a perfect stage bow. It was just her bending forward to say thank you. When she straightened up, the noise got even louder, if that was even possible. The crowd loved her humility. She looked off to the side of the stage, into the wings. Earlier, the other contestants had been laughing and pointing. Now they were standing there in silence. The tall girl with the expensive dress had her arms crossed over her chest, and her face looked serious. She wasn't laughing anymore. She looked like she had just seen a ghost, or maybe she looked like she realized that money can't buy everything. She was watching Priya with a look of respect, perhaps mixed with a little bit of envy. The bullies were quiet. Priya didn't need to say anything to them. Her performance had spoken louder than any comeback line ever could. The host walked onto the stage. He had to wait several seconds because the cheering was so loud that no one would be able to hear him. He held up his hands to try and calm the crowd down, a big grin on his face. He looked different too. He wasn't treating her like a joke anymore. He looked at her like she was a star. "Priya! Priya!" The crowd started to chant her name. Hearing her name chanted by hundreds of strangers was a feeling she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. It gave her goosebumps all over again. The host finally managed to quiet the room down enough to speak. I don't know what to say," the host said, laughing into his own microphone. "I think we all need a minute to recover from that. Priya, that was absolutely incredible." He walked over to her and gently took her hand, raising it high in the air like a winner. The crowd roared again. Priya smiled, a genuine, bright smile that reached her eyes. She felt light. She felt like she could fly. She walked slowly across the stage toward the stairs, waving to the crowd. As she moved, people in the front rows reached out their hands, wanting to touch her dress or just get closer to the magic that had just happened. It was a surreal moment. Just 10 minutes ago, they had ignored her. Now they were reaching for her dot when she walked backstage. The atmosphere was totally different. The stage manager, the one who had been so rude when he fixed the microphone, walked up to her immediately. He didn't look angry this time. He looked impressed. Great job, kid, he said, giving her a thumbs up. Really great job. Thank you, Priya whispered. Her voice was hoarse from singing. She found a quiet corner and leaned against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor. She put her head in her hands and took a deep breath. It was over. She had done it. She thought about her parents at home, watching their small TV. She hoped they were seeing this. She hoped they knew that all their sacrifices were worth it. A few minutes later, one of the other contestants walked by. It wasn't the mean girl, but a shy boy who had performed earlier and didn't do very well. He stopped in front of her. He looked nervous. I just wanted to say, he said quietly, that you were amazing. You inspired me. Priya looked up at him. She smiled. Thank you. You were good too, she said kindly. The boy smiled back and walked away. It made Priya realize something important. Winning was great. The applause was wonderful. But the best part was that she stayed true to who she was. She didn't try to copy the fancy people. She didn't try to be someone she wasn't. She got up there and was herself, flaws and all, and the world loved her for it. The loud music started playing again as the show prepared to move on to the next segment. But for Priya, the music in her heart was all that mattered. She stood up, dusted off her simple blue dress, and held her head high. She walked toward the exit with a new kind of confidence in her step. She walked out of the competition hall and into the cool night air, ready for whatever came next. She knew now that she could face anything. The girl they expected to fail had just stunned them all, and she was never going to forget that feeling.